everybody, I'm Jack Flyer, and today I'll be reading chapter 6, The First Adventure, from my book, The Diary of Jack Flyer. So if you could hit the like button, and anyone that hasn't subscribed, if you could subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. Let's get into it. Chapter 6, The First Adventure. May 5th, 1982. The plan to fly the Great Ocean Road has come together rather well. Charlie has his Quicksilver ready, and Tommy has his motorised hang glider sorted out. We plan to fly out from here at home at around 7:30 AM. Me in my Stolero, Charlie in his Quicksilver, and Tommy in his hang glider trike. Feeling quite anxious and very excited. As we all know, there will be a number of rules broken, but all in the name of adventure. May 6, 1982, Day 1. We were all ready by 7 AM, but as the sun rose, so did the usual fog. Old Charlie wanted to wait for the fog to clear, but I was keen to get above it and get our trip underway. By 7:45, I convinced old Charlie it was time. Tommy was first airborne in his contraption, but hell, it flies well. Then I persuaded Charlie to get up next, as he would be leading. Then it was my turn. I opened her up and let the tail raise. I glanced at the airspeed, 35 knots, and rotate. And then the engine surged and stopped completely. Oh shit, not now! I rolled off to the side of the strip and climbed out in a panic and searched the engine for something obvious. I then started cursing as I pulled out the toolkit and began frantically removing the spark plugs. By this stage, both Charlie and Tommy had landed. I'd swapped plugs but still could not get her to fire when Tommy said, "You haven't turned the fuel on, numbnuts." Whoops. After a prime and an easy start, we all got airborne. With Charlie leading, we headed south with a lovely 3-knot tailwind. We were sitting on 45 knots and the air was so smooth. I felt an overwhelming warmth come over me as I gracefully drifted across the sky in a loose formation with my fellow pioneers. In my eyes, I was in a Newport 11C1 with my squadron seeking out the enemy Fokkers. The new UHF radios we installed are great, but I wish old Charlie would stop commenting on every bloody paddock we cross. If you look to your right, you'll see Murphy's farm, and on your left, that's his ram paddock. Ram paddock? Who gives a toss, Charlie? Bloody ram paddock. Our first obstacle was the Sylvan Reservoir, as there's a fair bit of scrub around it. We had decided to stay east of Mount Evelyn and follow the Mombolk Road. It is truly magnificent country, I must add, and the view of the reservoir was awesome with the fog emanating off the still glass-like surface, and watching our 3 shadows moving in unison across the land was just stunning. We then headed slightly south-southwest from Mombolk, which took us across some scrub along the Cardinia Reservoir. The Cardinia Reservoir is massive in comparison to the Sylvan Reservoir. I was rather nervous flying over the scrub, but this nice smooth air eased my anxiety. The scrub seemed to run forever, right past Upper Beaconsfield, and when we finally reached open country, after some 15 minutes, I was very relieved. We then continued to our first destination, a small grass strip just out of Tooradin. Charlie knows the fella there who flies Cessnas doing charter and joy flights. There was a shipwreck there, which was pretty cool. We arrived at 9 AM and had flown 55 kilometres, and it took an hour. Plan was to have a quick refuel and continue, but once old Charlie got talking, it took some 50 minutes before we took back to the air. Our next leg would take us around the coast over Hastings to a place called Bonio on the Mornington Peninsula. Again, Charlie knows a veggie grower whom happily let us land between one of the tractor rows, which was interesting to say the least. It was only about 20 feet wide, but ran for about a kilometre or more, but I'll get to that. The wind had picked up a bit, and there was some moderate turbulence around, and by now Tommy was complaining about the ride. I think the Western Port winds might have contributed to the turbulence. From Hastings, we headed slightly inland to pick up a small road called Brown's Road, where Charlie's mate's farm is located. I'd been worried about finding this tractor row, but Steve, Charlie's mate, had put white buckets out to market. Charlie landed first, then I followed. Then Tommy came down for his approach, but seemed to really be fighting for control, or fighting his weight, and landed fairly hard, but we couldn't find any damage. We were looked after by Steve and his wife, whom drove us to the town of Rosebud for refueling and supplies. The evening was spent going over details of our next leg, which had been the centre of much debate. Charlie was adamant we should cross over Portsea to Queenscliff via the Port Phillip Bay Heads, but Tommy and we'd rather fly around Melbourne to Torquay. We ended up going with Charlie's choice just so we could get some sleep. Plus, he insisted on disregarding the regulations and cross at a height of 1,000 feet so we can glide to land if the engine stops. May 7th, 1982, Day 2. We were all up early and rather anxious about the crossing, but we put our nerves to the side and were soon gaining high over Tookarook and Rye. We reached an altitude of 1,000 feet over White Cliffs and followed the bay coast past Sorrento towards Portsea. Here we had a slight obstacle, as there's an army camp at Portsea Heads and one on the other side at Port Lonsdale. This meant we had to fly a longer crossing to avoid their airspace. As we crossed, I was baffled as to how quiet it was. I'm guessing even Charlie was a bit weary, as he had stopped commenting at this stage. We reached Port Lonsdale and descended to 300 feet and tracked to Ocean Grove, then on to Barwon Heads. We followed the coast and by now the air had become rough. Charlie was back commenting and Tommy was getting anxious about the ride. From Barwon's Head the ride became not so enjoyable, and a number of times Tommy cursed us out for dragging him along on this adventure. He also mentioned more than once he'd like to land now. Charlie, however, mentioned it reminded him of his childhood at the local fair, riding on a merry-go-round. A merry-go-round? More like a rodeo bull with a cracker up its bum. I never let on to my feelings, but I too was feeling the stress of maintaining control. Tommy was really starting to panic and I moved closer to get a clear visual on him. I watched his kite bobbing up and down, but noticed the frame in which he sits was swinging and twisting all over the place. However, the wing seemed to be pretty stable. I reassured Tommy that his wing was stable and it was only his frame swinging around, but was swiftly told that I should try swinging around in it then. At this stage I'd become aware of the fact that my plane was not being affected by much turbulence at all, and realised I was slightly over the beach, and both Tommy and Charlie were about 200 feet inland. I informed them to fly over the water where the air was smooth, and before I'd finished my sentence, Tommy was already a kilometre out to sea. Charlie, on the other hand, decided he was enjoying the merry-go-round ride and continued over the coastline. I should mention that Charlie was worse affected by turbulence with a huge 40-foot wingspan. We continued to Torquay, where it was decided on a beach landing. Charlie would go first, as he has performed a number of beach landings on his early expeditions. I noted he landed very close to the shoreline, and Tommy followed the same approach. I lined up and touched down perfect and made my first beach landing. We parked up on the beach and it was decided to wait for the cool of the afternoon to continue. We were back up at 3 p.m. and headed slightly inland for Colac. This would be our longest leg to date, at some 60 kilometres. By heading to Colac, we avoided some nasty tiger country. The leg was uneventful, and we were greeted at the small grass strip at Colac by the owners Harold and Joan. Great hospitality. May 8th, Day 3. Wind was way up this morning and we decided to wait for it to settle, but that didn't happen. May 9th, Day 4. The conditions were better, but there was still a lot of cloud around. We were told by a local charter pilot that there was a bit of turbulence around and Tommy got cold feet. May 10th, Day 5. We were graced with a beautiful morning and conditions were near perfect. We now had the challenge of a 90-kilometre flight to Warrnambool, and all calculations for fuel would leave us plenty in reserve. With Charlie using the most, he'd still have 1 hour or more reserve. From Colac, we tracked along the Princess Highway, taking the view of the lakes. We then flew direct over Cobden to Warrnambool. This was a very enjoyable flight, but I was getting a little cramped by the time we arrived, nearly 2 hours after takeoff. From Warrnambool, we'd planned on tracking the coast to Portland, but a local pilot at Warrnambool suggested we fly out to Lady Julia Percy Island, as it's only 9 kilometres off the coast. I really didn't like that idea of an unplanned flight, but both Charlie and Tommy were keen. Tommy just likes a smooth ride over the water. We followed the coast past Port Fairy and could make out the small island off the coast. There was a lot of cloud moving in from the west and I noted it to Charlie and suggested abandoning the flight out to the island. It would be disappointing, but Charlie agreed. As the weather moved in, I became anxious for some reason about the ground below and decided to head inland towards the Princess Highway, where an outlanding was more forgiving. We were flying over a small town called Heylbut when Charlie yelled, "Engine trouble!" I watched him begin a shallow circle descent, and he radioed, "Engine surging, have to land." Tommy and I circled and watched poor old Charlie dump it in a paddock, and then his radio died. From our view, it looked like a nice landing, but communication was lost. Tommy and I decided we'd also make an outlanding and make sure Charlie was okay. I came down first and lined up a flat patch in the paddock, but when I drew near, I could see the paddock was rough. I felt committed to landing and continued my approach. Upon touchdown, I hit a rabbit hole and my right main undercarriage was torn clean off the frame. My right wingtip then dug into the ground and she ground looped. I quickly radioed Tommy to abandon his landing, but he stressed he could not find his way out without us. By this stage, Charlie was hovering over me, cursing my decision to land. I informed him of Tommy's predicament and we began looking for the best spot for him to put down. We lined him up and informed him to use Charlie and I as the runway threshold, and we stood about 60 feet apart for Tommy to aim between. Tommy made a perfect greaser landing, only rolled for about 30 metres. Not too bad, them trikes. Charlie's Quicksilver had also sustained undercarriage damage, and it was apparent that we would not be proceeding anytime soon. May 14th, 1982. After a lot of phone calls and a few hours on the spanners pulling all our planes down, we had them loaded onto trailers and were heading home to Doris's delight. Oh well, back to the hangar for a fix-up, methinks, and a well-deserved beer or two, or 3 or 4. May 16th, 1982. Charlie informed me that he found the cause of his engine losing power, and it was a grain of sand in the carby, more likely picked up from our beach landing.